Hi students, Steve Brown. Today we're going to be looking at macroeconomics and the foundational concepts that are going to lead you into further studies. Macroeconomics is all about the total economy and is a study of concepts such as economic growth, inflation, and other related economic variables. In this video, we introduce students to concepts such as aggregate flows, and we use models using aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves in order to study and understand macroeconomic variables in greater detail. The economy can be simplified into a diagram that shows flows within a market, factors of production, working in the productive sectors of the economy earn income. This income is spent on goods and services within the economy. This circular flow of income therefore details how economic activity is translated from production into spending. Having identified the flows in the economy, we now move to a popular macroeconomic model that details both the aggregate demand and aggregate supply side of the economy. In this model, we deal with the general level of prices and the total output of production in an economic system. The aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between total real expenditure and the price level, whilst the aggregate supply curve shows the relationship between total real production in the economy and the price level. Let us look at these curves in greater detail. The aggregate demand curve represents aggregate levels of spending by consumers, firms, and the government, and is inclusive of the foreign sector. The aggregate demand curve is downward sloping due to the fact that as price levels fall, consumption and investment increases due to changes in wealth and interest rates. A change in price levels will cause a movement along the curve. Change in expenditure patterns, such as increased consumption and increased government spending, will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, and a decrease in consumption and government spending will shift the curve to the left. The aggregate supply curve represents the total quantity of goods and services supplied at each aggregate price level. The curve is upward sloping as a result of positive relationship between a higher price level and a higher output. The aggregate supply curve will shift when there is a change in costs or productivity relating to factors of production and other inputs into the production process. Changes in spending will shift the aggregate demand curve. Therefore, higher levels of consumer and government and investment spending will equal higher levels of prices, but will also provide higher levels of output. Whilst higher changes in costs or productivity will shift the aggregate supply curve to the left, which will equal higher prices but lower output. This higher price will translate into inflation. Inflation can be discussed through the prism of this model. In this diagram, inflation is shown by rising prices being pulled strongly by higher levels of aggregate demand. In the next diagram, inflation is being pushed by higher levels of rising costs. These costs could be things such as higher levels of petrol and energy costs in an economic system, or they could be higher levels of labor costs. We have looked at the basics of flows in the economy and how a macroeconomic model can show what happens to levels of productions and prices as expenditure and production levels change. We use these foundational concepts now to further explore macroeconomic concepts. Thank you for watching. I hope the concepts that we've learned today will help you with your broad understanding of macroeconomics.